Welcome, restless spirits, to a realm where shadows deepen and the veil between dreams and reality fades. Here, time moves differently, and the silence around you is filled with whispers of the unknown. In this space, your mind is free to drift into a world where the strange feels familiar, and the familiar becomes extraordinary. So relax, let your thoughts wander, and prepare to enter tonight's story, where the only guide is your imagination. Tonight, we present Graven Encounters. Ella adjusted the focus on her camera, the lens capturing the intricate details of an old weathered gravestone. The warm hues of the setting sun bathed the cemetery in a golden light, casting long shadows that gave the scene an ethereal beauty. She'd been coming here for years, drawn to the peacefulness and mystery of the place. Graveyards, to her, weren't morbid. They were full of history, art, and stories waiting to be told. Another perfect shot, she whispered to herself, satisfied with the way the image turned out on her camera screen. Her best friend, Ben, leaned against a nearby tree, arms crossed, watching her with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "I'll never get why you're so obsessed with this place," Ben said, shaking his head with a grin. Ella smiled as she lowered the camera. "It's not obsession, it's appreciation. Look at this." She waved her hand toward the rows of gravestones and statues surrounding them. These are people's lives, their legacies, captured in stone, and the light right now, it's like magic. Ben pushed off the tree and joined her, glancing at the angel statue she was now preparing to photograph. The angel stood tall, its wings slightly spread, as if it were on the verge of taking flight. Time had worn its features, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. "I get that," Ben said, "but doesn't it ever creep you out? You know, being around all these graves, especially since it's almost Halloween." "Not really," Ella replied, snapping a few more photos. "It's peaceful here. I think cemeteries are more for the living than the dead anyway. It's a way to remember them, to keep their stories alive." As she spoke, a soft voice startled them both. "You have a good eye for this place." They turned to see an older woman approaching, her silver hair shining in the fading sunlight. Ella recognized her immediately, Mrs. Chesterfield, the town librarian, and a frequent visitor to the cemetery. She often brought fresh flowers to the older graves, those long forgotten by family members. "Mrs. Chesterfield," Ella greeted her warmly. "What brings you out here?" "Oh, just paying my respects, as always," Mrs. Chesterfield replied, her eyes drifting over the gravestones. She paused when she saw Ella's camera. "Capturing the beauty of these monuments, I see. You do fine work, Ella." "Thank you," Ella said, blushing slightly. Mrs. Chesterfield had always been kind to her, often encouraging her photography and even pointing out historical graves that had interesting backstories. The older woman stepped closer, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, there's an old story about this cemetery, one not many people remember. It's about the Graven." "The Graven?" Ben asked, intrigued despite himself. "Like the dead?" Mrs. Chesterfield chuckled. No. Thaddeus Graven was a sculptor, one of the finest in his time. He created many of the statues here, including that angel you were just photographing. She pointed to the towering figure. Legend has it that Thaddeus was so devoted to his craft that when he died, his spirit stayed behind to watch over his work. They say he protects the cemetery from those who might desecrate it. Ella's eyes lit up. That's fascinating. I didn't know the statues had such a backstory. Indeed, Mrs. Chesterfield said with a smile. But be mindful, my dear. The Graven doesn't take kindly to those who disrespect the dead. Some say the statues themselves have been known to move, watching over the cemetery as he once did. Ben raised an eyebrow. Statues moving? Sounds like a ghost story to scare tourists. Mrs. Chesterfield's expression darkened slightly. Perhaps, but some stories come from truth. Just remember, Ella, your photography is a gift, but always show respect. With that, she gave them a gentle nod and walked away. Her figure soon lost among the rows of gravestones. Ella stared after her, thoughts swirling. She's right, you know. I try to be respectful with all my photos. I'm not here to exploit anything, just to capture the beauty. Ben gave her a sideways glance. You always do. But you've got to admit, it's a little weird how serious she got about the Graven thing. Ella laughed, shaking off the slight chill Mrs. Chesterfield's warning had brought. Just a good ghost story for Halloween. Nothing to worry about. That evening, as Ella sat in her room reviewing the day's photos, she noticed something strange. In one of the pictures, taken of the angel statue just before Mrs. Chesterfield had arrived, there was a faint, shadowy figure in the background. It wasn't immediately obvious, but when she zoomed in, the form was clearer, vaguely human but not fully solid. Ella's pulse quickened. A trick of the light? Or something more? She immediately texted Ben a screenshot. Look at this. I caught something weird in the cemetery. Within seconds, her phone buzzed with his reply. Looks like fog or a smudge. You sure it's not a camera glitch? Ella frowned, studying the image. It didn't look like a glitch. The figure seemed too deliberate, too human. I'm not sure, she replied, biting her lip. But I want to check it out. Let's go back tonight, around midnight. Maybe there's something more. After a pause, Ben replied, You're nuts, but okay. Midnight it is. The cemetery was a different place at night. Under the full moon, the gravestones cast long, eerie shadows, and the statues seemed to take on a life of their own. The air was cooler, and the stillness carried a weight that hadn't been there during the day. Ella and Ben crept through the gates, flashlights in hand, their footsteps soft on the gravel path. Ella couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. She wasn't here to prove anything to herself, just to see if there was a story waiting to be discovered. As they approached the angel statue, the same one that had appeared in her photo, a faint scraping sound echoed through the cemetery. It was distant at first, like stone grinding against stone. Ella froze, turning to Ben, who had stopped as well. Did you hear that? She whispered. Ben nodded, his eyes scanning the darkened rows of gravestones. Yeah, but I don't see anything. The sound came again, closer this time. Ella turned her flashlight toward the angel, and for a moment, she thought its head had tilted ever so slightly. Her breath caught in her throat. "No way," she muttered, stepping closer. It couldn't have. The scraping noise grew louder, and Ella whipped around, and the beam of her flashlight landing on another statue. This one of a weeping woman, her face buried in her stone hands. The figure seemed to tremble, its posture shifting slightly. "Ella," Ben said, his voice low and tense. "I think we need to leave." But Ella couldn't move, her eyes glued to the statue. The scraping sound was now almost deafening, and suddenly, the figure of the weeping woman moved. Slowly, it lifted its head, revealing hollow, empty eyes. Its stone arms unfolded, and the statue turned toward them, as if acknowledging their presence. "Run!" Ben shouted, grabbing Ella's arm and pulling her back. They bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they sprinted through the maze of graves. But just as they reached the older part of the cemetery, a figure stepped into their path. It was a man, tall, with an ethereal glow. His face was stern, but not unkind, and his clothes were from a time long past. "Stop," the figure said, his voice calm yet commanding. Ella and Ben skidded to a halt, their breaths ragged. Who are you?" Ella stammered. The figure's eyes softened. "I am Thaddeus Graven, the sculptor of these monuments and their protector." Ella's heart pounded in her chest. You're real." Graven nodded slowly. "I am bound to this place, as are the statues you have seen. We guard the dead from those who would desecrate their rest." Ben stepped forward, still catching his breath. "We're not here to desecrate anything. Ella's a photographer. She loves this place. She's trying to show its beauty, not disrespect it." Graven's gaze shifted to Ella, his expression thoughtful. "I know. I have watched you for some time. Your work is not like the others who come here to vandalize and defile. You respect the dead." Ella's heart swelled with relief. "I do. I only want to capture the history, the beauty of this place. I would never disrespect it." Graven nodded, but his eyes darkened. "But others have not been so kind. Vandals have disturbed the graves, broken the stones, and the spirits are restless because of it." Ella felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She had heard about the occasional act of vandalism in the cemetery, but she hadn't realized how deeply it affected the place. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I want to help." Graven studied her for a moment before speaking. "There is a way. Use your camera. Tell the world the stories of this cemetery. Show them the beauty and history, so they may understand why it must be protected." Ella nodded, her mind racing with ideas. "I can do that. I can share the stories, the photos, everything." Graven's stern expression softened into something almost like gratitude. "Then the spirits will rest, and the statues will watch over them as I once did." With that, Graven's form began to fade, the glow around him dimming. The statues in the distance returned to their original unmoving state, the grinding sound finally silenced. Ella and Ben stood in the quiet cemetery, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a blanket. "We did it," Ben said quietly. "We actually met him." Ella smiled, though her heart was still racing. "And now we have a story to tell." The next day, Ella worked tirelessly, editing her photos and writing an article about the cemetery. She told the story of Thaddeus Graven, the sculptor whose legacy lived on in stone, and how the cemetery wasn't just a place for the dead, but a place for the living to remember, honor, and protect. When she posted the article and photos online, it quickly gained attention. People from all over the town, and even beyond, shared it, commenting on the beauty of the cemetery and the need to preserve its history. As the days passed, Ella returned to the cemetery, camera in hand. But now, as she walked among the gravestones, she felt a deeper connection to the place, knowing that her work wasn't just about capturing images. It was about honoring the past and ensuring that the dead could rest in peace. The statues, silent and still, stood as guardians of the cemetery. And though Thaddeus Graven was no longer visible, Ella knew he was there, watching over his creations, content that they and the cemetery were in safe hands. And so, dear listener, as the last echoes of tonight's tale fade into the stillness, we thank you for wandering these shadowed paths with us. In the quiet that remains, may your thoughts linger on the strange and wondrous mysteries that we have shared. Until we meet again in the twilight between reality and dreams, rest easy and remember, the unknown is never far away. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.